21. That is the exact number of lawmakers who have been kicked out of the United States Congress in its entire history.
Which is pretty wild when you think about it.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
But with a wave of new bipartisan scandals breaking right now, well, that number might actually be about to change.
It definitely could. The pressure is really boiling over on Capitol Hill right now.
Right. So let's just jump right into the breaking news driving our deep dive today. We've got two prominent politicians facing some really intense potential expulsion threats.
Yeah, and the allegations on both sides are, well, they're severe.
They really are. So first, you have Democratic Representative Eric Swalwell of California. The Manhattan District Attorney is currently investigating sexual assault allegations from a former staffer.
Right, and her claims are very detailed. She alleges that he pursued her right after she was hired, sending, inappropriate Snapchat messages demanding explicit photos.
And it goes further than that, right? The claims detail two separate instances of alleged sexual assault, one in 2019 and another in 2024. And they reportedly involved extreme intoxication and a hotel room encounter that resulted in injuries.
Yeah, that's what the allegations say.
Yeah.
Now, to be clear, Swalwell is vehemently denying all of this.
Right. He says they are total fabrication.
Exactly. He claims this is entirely politically motivated to hurt his current run for California governor, and he's actually threatening legal action against the accuser.
But the political heat is just as intense across the aisle right now. You've got Republican Representative Tony Gonzales of Texas.
Right.
And he has publicly admitted to an affair with a former aide, Regina Santos Avalos, who very tragically died by suicide last year.
Yeah, it's an awful situation. And now the House Ethics Committee is investigating whether he engaged in sexual misconduct or, dispensed any special favors.
Because there are text messages, right. Texts provided by the late staffer's widower showing Gonzales asking for explicit photos.
Exactly. And the investigation is really zeroing in on the timeline of a raise and a bonus that she received during the same year the alleged affair happened.
Now, Gonzales takes full responsibility for the affair itself, but he aggressively denies tying her compensation to their relationship. He says the pay bump happened before the alleged incidents.
Right. And all of this is unfolding while he's fighting a really tight primary runoff election in Texas against a gun rights activist, Brandon Herrera.
So you have this massive standoff right now. Republican Representative Anna Paulina Luna is pushing to expel Swalwell, while Democrats are countering with threats to expel Gonzales.
And there are even murmurs of targeting other scandal-ridden reps, folks like Corey Mills and Sheila Cherfilus McCormick.
It's a complete powder keg. So for our deep dive today, we are taking your stack of sources from CBS News, the Texas Tribune, NodeOTS, Wikipedia, and a really detailed Congressional Research Service report to explore this ultimate congressional punishment.
Right. Expulsion. We're going to unpack how it actually works, the history behind it, and the really messy legal gray area of punishing politicians for past behavior.
But before we get into all that, I need to make something very clear to you, our listener. Because our sources today cover highly politically charged allegations involving both Democrats and Republicans, we want to be crystal clear. We are not taking any sides.
Absolutely not.
We are simply here to impartially report the facts as presented in your source material, not to endorse any political viewpoint.
Exactly. We're just looking at the mechanics and the history.
Right. So let's start with those mechanics. Before we can look at the historical precedent for these current scandals, we need to understand how a lawmaker actually gets fired.
Yeah, and it's not easy. If we look at the Rulebook, Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution, it expressly gives each chamber the power to determine its own rules and punish its members.
Okay.
But for expulsion, the founders intentionally created a massive hurdle. It requires a strict two-thirds supermajority vote.
Which is, almost impossible in today's political climate. So how does it actually happen?
Well, it usually starts with a resolution, but it doesn't just go straight to the floor for a vote. It gets routed to the House or Senate Ethics Committee for an investigation.
Which is exactly what we're seeing with Tony Gonzales right now.
Right. The committee basically launches a full-scale investigation. They issue subpoenas, interview witnesses under oath, and hold adjudicatory hearings.
So they essentially act as like a grand jury and a trial court rolled into one.
That's a great way to put it. And only if the committee formally recommends expulsion does the full chamber actually get to vote.
Okay, but the sources point out a really critical legal difference here that I think people confuse all the time, the difference between expulsion and exclusion.
Yes, this is huge. Expulsion means removing a seated, duly elected member, and that takes the two-thirds vote. Exclusion is when Congress refuses to seat a newly elected member in the first place.
And that only requires simple majority, right?
Yeah, exactly. But the Supreme Court actually weighed in on this in a landmark case, Powell v. McCormack.
Oh, right, because Congress tried to use exclusion as a loophole.
You got it.
Yeah.
They tried to block Representative Adam Clayton Powell Jr. at the door with a simple majority because he had some corruption allegations. But the court said, no, you can't do that.
Because if they meet the constitutional qualifications, age, citizenship, residency, you have to seat them.
Right. If you want to kick them out for bad behavior, you have to do the hard work of getting a 2/3 vote for expulsion.
Which makes sense. I mean, think of it like this. Usually, the voters act as the hiring manager. But expulsion means getting fired by your coworkers instead of your boss.
That's exactly what it is.
And if the Constitution doesn't clearly define what an expellable offense is, what stops the majority party from just grouping together and voting out the minority party members they don't like?
Well, that's exactly why James Madison championed that 2/3 supermajority. It's the specific safeguard designed to prevent partisan purges.
Okay, so they need broad bipartisan consensus.
Right. And what's interesting is that the Supreme Court considers this a political question, meaning they leave it almost entirely up to the unbridled discretion of Congress.
So if it just takes a vote by coworkers to kick someone out, why is the threat of expulsion suddenly making such massive headlines today?
Because, historically speaking, it almost never happens.
Right. Going back to that number 21, out of thousands of people who have served, only 21 have ever been expelled. 15 in the Senate, 6 in the House.
Yeah, the standard for action historically borders on apocalyptic. I mean, 17 of those 21 expulsions happened during a 2-year window in the Civil War in 1861 and 1862.
Wow. Wait, so they were expelled just for supporting the Confederate Rebellion?
Exactly. It was about sheer survival for the Union. And even before that, the very first expulsion in 1797 was Senator William Blount.
Oh, I read about this in the sources. He was removed by a 25-to-1 vote for literal treason.
Right. He conspired to incite a rebellion among Native American tribes to help the British conquer Spanish territories, basically for his own financial gain.
That is insane. So historically, you basically had to commit literal treason, start a rebellion, or go to federal prison to actually get booted.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
In modern times, it's strictly tied to severe criminal convictions and corruption, like Michael Myers in 1980 for the Abscam bribery scandal.
Or James Traficant in 2002 for racketeering and tax evasion.
Right. And most recently, George Santos in 2023 for fraud and campaign fund misuse. They all had severe criminal consequences hanging over them.
But wait, do lawmakers ever face consequences for severe scandals that fall short of treason or a criminal conviction?
They do, but it's more about the threat of expulsion rather than the vote itself. The threat is actually highly effective.
How so? Like, do they just quit?
Exactly. Many lawmakers resign before a formal vote can publicly humiliate them on the floor.
Oh, right. Like Senator Robert Packwood in 1995 over sexual misconduct?
Yeah, the Ethics Committee recommended expulsion, and he resigned before the vote. Same with Representative Raymond Lederer in 1981 over bribery. The threat cleans house efficiently.
Okay, so that brings us directly to the core legal and ethical dilemma facing the Swalwell and Gonzales cases today. How does Congress handle misconduct that happens before an election?
This is where things get really tricky. Historically, Congress hates expelling members for things they did before they were elected or re-elected to their current term.
Why? I mean, if they did something terrible, shouldn't they be held accountable?
Well, they wrestle with balancing two things. On one hand, maintaining the dignity of the institution, but on the other hand, respecting the democratic choice of the voters.
Okay. The Congressional Research Service report calls this the known versus unknown standard.
Exactly. If the voters had full knowledge of a scandal if it was known, but they elected the person anyway, Congress usually backed off.
Which is like my job interview analogy. If you sit in an interview and tell a hiring manager about a huge mistake in your past, and they hire you anyway, it feels really wrong for them to fire you for it a year later.
That's a perfect analogy. And we saw this in 1979 with Representative Charles C. Diggs, Jr. He was reelected after a criminal conviction.
Wait, really? The voters knew he was convicted and still voted for him?
They did, and the House only censured him. They explicitly stated it was out of due respect for his constituents' decision.
But if you lied on your resume or concealed the scandal, that's different.
Right, if the misconduct was unknown to the voters, like the Packwood sexual misconduct case, Congress is much more willing to wield the expulsion power because the voters were deceived.
But the sources say Congress has been pretty inconsistent with this over the years, right?
Very inconsistent. Look at the 1872 credit mobilier scandal. Two different committees investigated the exact same scandal and couldn't even agree if they had the jurisdiction to expel members for past acts.
Wow. So one committee said yes and the other said no.
Pretty much. And it took until a 1914 judiciary report to kind of settle it. That report said, yes, Congress does have the constitutional power to expel for prior acts.
But they attached a massive warning to it, right? They warned against substituting Congress's ideals for the ideals of the voters.
Exactly. They said it should be exercised with extreme hesitation.
So let me push back a little on this regarding today's standoff. In the cases of Swalwell and Gonzales, these scandals are breaking news to the public right now.
Right.
But the alleged acts happened while they were already serving in politics during previous terms. So does that obligate Congress to act, or do they just leave it up to the voters in the next election?
Well, it isn't really a question of constitutional power. Congress legally can expel them. It's really a question of policy and democratic norms.
So they're just terrified of overriding the will of the people.
Exactly. And you're seeing this tension play out live in Texas right now. The granular details of Gonzales' affair broke right before early voting.
Right, and it caused a massive 18-point swing that forced him into a tight runoff against Brandon Herrera.
Exactly. So Congress has every incentive to just stall. Why take a painful, politically risky expulsion vote if the voters in Texas might just fire him themselves at the ballot box?
That makes total sense. They'd rather the voters do the dirty work. Which really connects everything back to you, the listener, and your role as a voter. Because expulsion is unequivocally the most powerful disciplinary tool Congress has.
It's the ultimate penalty.
But because they are so hesitant to use it out of respect for the democratic process, it places an incredible amount of power and responsibility directly into the hands of the voters.
It really does. If Congress won't fire their own, the duty defaults to the public.
Which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought for you to mull over. If Congress relies on this forgiveness doctrine, refusing to expel members if the public reelects them despite knowing about their scandals, does that mean the ultimate burden of policing the morality of the government rests entirely on you, the voter, every time you step into the ballot box?
It's a heavy responsibility for sure.
It really is. The power to actually clean house has always belonged to you.